Immigration is changing Europe's demographic makeup. The data is pretty clear. In nearly all European countries, the share of the native population is falling. And the thing is, there's a form of denial with people saying that we've always had immigration and refugees, ignoring the unprecedented nature of non-European immigration and its scale. On the other hand of the debate, there is a lot of doomerism with the conspiratorial replacement theory, which says that Europe's native population is being replaced voluntarily by non-Europeans. So I decided to look into this phenomenon to quantify how immigration is changing the ethnic makeup of Europe. I looked into data from national statistical databases and government reports, including this time the UK census data, Eurostat, as well as scientific papers into births of non-ethnic Europeans, to build a complete picture of immigration as it is now and how it might evolve in the future. This is the story of the demographics of immigration. So in 2022, roughly 1.2 million people entered the EU regularly, with about 300,000 irregular entries. In the UK, the number was about 700,000 regular migrants plus about 40,000 regular entries, or about 0.4% and 1% of their population respectively. But since this flow has been pretty constant, these numbers add up, as has the share of Europe's foreign-born population. In fact, the share of foreign-born in many Western European countries is higher than that for the United States, a country that has long been seen as the king of immigration. This is the result of two things. First, the Schengen area, which eliminated borders between EU countries and made it easier for Europeans to move around. But it's also the result of waves of immigration that have come to Europe over the past several decades, in the form of the guest workers of the 50s and 60s, the refugees from the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, and more recently, the migration crisis. So let's see what happens when we break this foreign-born population migration by region of origin, EU and non-EU, which incidentally is also what the UK does. Unfortunately, this neglects some Europeans, most notably Ukrainians, the Balkan countries, but also UK residents in the EU. There were, for example, 300,000 UK migrants in Spain and 163,000 in France. The countries with the largest population born outside the EU were in Sweden, Ireland, and interestingly enough, Estonia actually count their ethnic Russian populations as non-citizens. At the other end of the spectrum were Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Bulgaria. But if you want to account for demographic change, we need to look further back. The flow of non-European migration started in the 1950s in some Western European countries. Immigrants had kids, and in some cases grandchildren, which we need to add up in order to get the total number of non-European descended population. One way to look into this is using data from the EU's Labour Force Survey, which looks into people aged 15 to 64 and allows us to classify them according to their migration background and that of their parents. It has some limitations in that it excludes both the most recent wave of migration, since the children would be under the age of 15, as well as older migration waves, whose descendants are now in the third generation. This means that these numbers are underestimates for the number of immigrant-descended population, but they should at least give us an idea of the trend. The countries with the highest non-European population are in Western and Northern Europe, with most Western European countries being between 14 and 18%. Though I wasn't able to include Sweden and Belgium since they messed up their data entry to Eurostat and their numbers didn't add up to 100%. Good job, Sweden and Belgium. But let's see if we can take it a step further and also look into the newest generation as well as third-generation migrants by diving into the national statistical databases of some countries. We can only do this for a few countries who actually provide this data. In the case of England and Wales, this is pretty straightforward. The government collects ethnic data on people by race and religion with some pretty detailed maps. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to classify people into 4 categories: white British Island natives, other whites, including mixed race, and non-mixed non-whites. We can see that 75% of the entire British population is native white, while about 20% of the country's people are from a non-European background. Most continental countries understandably don't publish ethnic data like this, since in the past it's been used for some questionable endeavors, not least the genocides of the 20th century. But we have some workarounds for some countries. Denmark, for example, distinguishes between Western and non-Western migration background, even for citizens. The only way you can get rid of that label is by being born to at least one Danish parent or Western parent. 84% of the country was native Danish, while about 10% of the country was non-Western descended. The French Statistics Office published a study into this specific subject. So we also have this number for them for the third generation for people under the age of 60. Keep in mind that this data includes children with a single immigrant parent and grandchildren with a single immigrant grandparent as well. And so the number of immigrant-descended population is likely overrepresented. About 67% of the population was fully native descendant, while about 15 and 17% of the population had at least one European or non-European grandparent respectively. But we can ask ourselves how this trend will evolve in the future. As I previously mentioned, immigrants, and in particular non-European migrants, have higher birth rates than natives. And since many natives and European immigrants tend to be older, they skew the population statistics to being more European, while younger generations are much more diverse. So to look at Europe's demographic future, we have to look at the number of births in different European countries by country of origin. Here again, we run into a problem of a lack of data for many countries. I tried to find the numbers for Germany, Italy, Austria, or Sweden with the breakdown, but they do not publish them or do not make the distinction between European and non-European migration. So again, we're going to focus on the UK, Denmark, and France, as well as the Netherlands, who does publish a similar statistic. For Denmark, that number is more or less stable, with the births mirroring the share of total population. In the Netherlands, non-European births make up 18% of all births versus 10% of the total population under the age of 55 that has foreign-born parents. But we have to keep in mind that this data might face the same problems we faced previously by excluding the third generation that I mentioned. In the case of the UK, we can see the difference of about 10% in the white population, with the mixed race category making up more than half of the increase in non-white population. Mixed race made up 9% of the total population, with people with a mixed white ethnicity making up 6% of that total. There's a similar trend in France, with a 15% lower share of the native and European descended population in the younger generation, but also accompanied with a 6% rise in mixed non-European and native births. In fact, many of France's third-generation immigrants have mixed ancestry, with 71% of North African immigrants and 89% of other African migrants having only one or two non-native grandparents. For the countries I couldn't exclude, I can only speculate that similar trends apply. And considering the scale of non-European immigrants that have entered Germany, Austria, and Sweden since 2015, as well as the historical immigration they've received, the number of births would likely be equally, if not higher, than those for France or the UK. One thing to keep in mind when we take a look at these results at the national level is that immigrants cluster in cities, which means that in those areas, the share of immigrant-descended population is far higher. We can see this in the ethnic maps of the UK, for example, with London, Birmingham, and Leicester having white, in other words, native European minorities. And the same is true for most European countries. Saint-Saint-Denis to the north of Paris, Amsterdam West in the Netherlands, or Berlin, for example, are known for being ethnically segregated areas with majority non-European descended populations. This also has the result of making the demographic shift much more visible to the everyday person in those areas. So what happens next? Well, there are two paths forward for Europe's populations. The first is that they will continue to form separate and growing ethnic minorities within their countries, while the other is that Europe's immigrants intermarry with natives and have kids. One way we already touched on this was the rise in mixed background population in the UK, which accounted for 9% of total births, or the fact that 12.2% of all French births were mixed origin. Another way to actually measure this is to look into intermarriage rates between different immigrant groups. This 2006 study looks into exogamous behavior, the rate at which people would marry outside their group for 7 European countries. Across the board, second-generation migrants were more likely to marry outside of their immigrant communities than first-gen. But there are huge differences between cultures of the immigrants and that of their host countries. We can, for example, see that Western immigrants tended to intermarry with locals at far higher rates, while immigrants of Turkish descent were actually the least likely to marry outside of their groups. But for other immigrant groups, there were quite some interesting trends. For example, in the UK, Indian and Caribbean migrants had relatively higher rates of marriages with people outside their group. In France, migrants from North Africa were 4 times as likely to marry outside of their group than Moroccans in Belgium. In fact, if we compare this with data from the French Statistics Office, about 40% of marriages are taking place with natives. Though I have to say the data is a bit murky on this, since it could be that the emerging 4th generation of immigrants, which would be classified as natives, gives the impression of higher intermarriage rates. In this 2022 study by the Dutch government on the same subject, we can see that Moroccans and Turks were the least likely to intermarry with locals, but Indonesians intermarry with Dutch people at very high rates. So where does this all leave us? Well, the higher proportion of non-European birth means that the share of non-European descended population in Europe is likely to increase. But the extent to which it changes depends on a couple things, most notably how birth rates for natives and immigrants and their descendants will evolve in the future. In the Netherlands and Denmark, for example, the average number of kids by foreign women is less or roughly equivalent to that for native-born women, whereas in France, Germany, or the UK, it is much higher. It also depends on how immigration will continue to play out in the future. More immigration will obviously lead to a more non-European descended population in the future. All of this paints a rather mixed picture. Europe is undergoing an undeniable demographic shift, with some Western European countries becoming increasingly diverse. In some countries, these communities are isolated from the rest of the population, but others, like in the UK or France, present some evidence of being potential melting pots with high rates of intermarriages between natives and some communities of non-European migrants. And there's still an ongoing question of which values are emerging from that mix, and if some minorities adopt European values, turn into a blended mix, or keep their own. But that is the subject for a different video. If you want to know more about the nature of immigration to Europe, where people come from and what they come to do, then I invite you to watch this video that I previously made on Europe's immigrants. I also wanted to say that this video was quite challenging to make, particularly in terms of the data that is actually available. Government sources are obscure or limited in scope, journalistic sources were quite superficial, and recent academic sources are virtually inexistent, with the amount of research dwindling pretty clearly after 2015. Which is ironic considering that's the year the migration crisis started. It also means that this type of video takes quite a lot of time to make, and because it's controversial, I also don't feel comfortable putting a sponsored segment on it. I wanted to talk about how you could help support me in making such content. One of my goals for the upcoming couple of months is to be able to rent out an office space where I can build a studio, instead of having to build and set up all my gear on weekends in the middle of my co-working space. This results in inconsistent lighting, sound quality, and also just takes up a lot of time. I estimate that where I am, it would need around 700 euros a month to be able to afford that, and since this is quite an important fixed monthly cost, I'd also like to be able to rely on fixed monthly income to take the step. That's why I'm turning to a crowdfunding campaign. I would need about 180 of the lowest €3 tier that I have available on Patreon to make this happen. I recently revamped Patreon privileges and the interior of Discord server, making it exclusive to Patreon subscribers in order to make this possible. And I will do my best to be active there and post updates on my work and other things I find interesting. So if you'd like to support the channel and more work like this one, go check out the interior Patreon.